Representative Ron Paul has been a longtime critic of the Federal Reserve's practices. His best-selling book, End the Fed. He's an advocate of going back to some sort of currency that's based on something of value. Right now, of course, the dollar is worth 1/1400th of an ounce of gold. That's hard to believe. Joining us now is Representative Ron Paul. Representative Paul, welcome back to the program, and good to have you.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
I want to get into, obviously, your new role on the Domestic Monetary Policy Subcommittee. I sense you're salivating this one. But before we do, I just heard at the top of the hour that Reid has pulled the omnibus bill from the Senate now. That's the good news as far as I'm concerned. And the House is still debating the tax deal. What on earth is going on in this dysfunctional lame duck session?
Well, the country and the government is bankrupt, and they don't want to admit it. And they think they can keep patching this together endlessly with all the old tricks, and they're not able to. And the politics of it is just so difficult. Nobody will cut anything, and it's
right.
unmanageable because they will not accept the fact that our government, is doing things they should have never done, and we're in over our heads, and they have no idea what they ought to do. And if they did know, they're not going to do it because they're afraid of the political repercussions.
Yeah, there's really no way out of this. I mean, to the degree we try to inflate our way out of this, we're already seeing the long bond interest rates go up. Inflation, as you well know, it's a sneaky way to get people to accept lower wages and devalue savings. People are going to flee the dollar, so there'll be a crisis with Chinese holding all of our debt. So you can't really do that over the long term. You can't fool the market. You can't tax your way out of this. You can't borrow your way out of it because we're not going to be able to honor our obligations. The fact is, spending has ramifications, and the country just now is finding out, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and as you describe it, and I agree with what you've just said, but, if you did the right thing, I would like to think that nobody has to sacrifice who's willing to work for a living. Can you imagine if tomorrow we got rid of the income tax? Oh,
right.
Okay. Just think of how many people would benefit by this. What if we cut a lot of spending? What if we cut all the spending overseas and so many other things? Yes, the people who benefit, if we quit the bailouts, the people who are ripping us off and getting bailed out and don't have to declare bankruptcy, yeah, they have problems. But the people who are still working and paying the bills, they would be much better off. They don't have to sacrifice.
Well,
today it's the opposite. The people who get bailed out get the benefits, and we're the ones who have to sacrifice.
Right. No.
We lose the value of our money, and we have to pay more taxes.
No question about that. Indeed, we have induced the moral hazard. So to encourage more silly risk-taking, to encourage more bailouts, we keep bailing people out, and that would just end in perpetuity. You're quite right about that. But we're at a tipping point, Congressman, when what's the last figure I saw from the Tax Foundation? I think over 50% of the people now, I think it was 60%, the figure was, get more from the government than they pay in taxes. Now, I'm not a big tax guy, but the fact is, when you get a majority that is in the wagon, it's going to be awfully hard to cut those rent seekers away from the government trough.
Yep, that's exactly what's wrong. It was predictable. When the welfare state started, they argued, it's just a couple people. We're the 3% who needs help. But the principle was 100%. The principle was that you can transfer wealth by force because somebody wants it or demands it or claims they have a right to it. And what it was 3%, grows and grows and grows, and the more it grows, the more it undermines our productive capacity. You throw in the problems of inflation, the destruction of your currency,
right.
Then that means that we had a unique situation because the dollar is the reserve currency, so more people were willing to take it.
Right.
So that made us even appear to be so much wealthier because all we had to do was export money and print money, and up until now they've been taking it. Half of our dollars are overseas because we live beyond our means.
Right.
We're a consumer nation, and we've lost our way. We're not a producer nation anymore.
But that's so important because we've been stuck on this Keynesian notion that you can just consume without the premise being you've got to produce first. In order to consume, you first have to earn the money and or produce. And we're under this false demand side notion that no, we just need consumers, and therefore extending unemployment benefits will increase some sort of Keynesian consumption without ever thinking where the money is coming from. And as you rightly point out, when you finance this through deficits, the money's coming from China, but God knows what's going to happen when they decide to dump the dollar. Now we're all of a sudden a third world banana republic.
Well, it originally comes from the Fed, and they create credit, and we spend it overseas. And the one basic flaw that we have is that investment money, they call that capital. But we really don't have true capital, because capital comes from people who save more than they earn. So if you make $100 a week and you can save 10, that builds up your capital. Then you can buy something and raise your standard of living. Today, nobody really saves. We haven't saved for years any significant amount.
Right.
So the Fed creates money, and they call that capital. But that's a distortion. That's just
I want to get to
existing money.
I definitely want to get to Fed policy before I let you go here in 10 minutes. But you make a very good point, though. The Federal Reserve policy notwithstanding, everybody, I happen to be a free trader, and everybody bemoans the trade deficit. But the trade deficit is merely the mirror image of our inability or refusal to save.
That's right. We don't, and we continue to spend. Now, you didn't have to worry about this when you have on a commodity standard, on the gold standard, and you can't print the money. What happens is you run out of money. The money supply shrinks. Our prices go down. We can't live by borrowing more money. We have to work harder in order to earn our money back. But there's no automatic mechanism now, because we just perpetuate the imbalances, and it's these imbalances that are screaming out right now. And everybody's throwing up their hands. What are we going to do? How do we get our jobs back? How do we balance our trade problems? And of course, now the scream is not for free trade. They say, what we have to do is protect our industries, and they want to put on protective tariffs, which only makes it worse, because that's a tax on the American people.
Well, you're a great Austrian guy, so you know exactly what has to happen with malinvestment in a recession, or when in a free market, there are people that make mistakes. If I build a typewriter factory today instead of a word processing factory, I'll work up some bad debt. I'll have to pay it off. And it's no different for a country. You've got to go through a depression of wages and prices. You need to pay off your bad debt. But what we're trying to do now with the bailouts, and primarily the Federal Reserve policy and tripling their balance sheet, is we're trying to avoid that contraction. Now, if we would have taken this contraction with sound money, and frankly not the Bush-Obama bailouts of 2008, we'd probably be recovering by now.
I think you're right, and that's what we should have done. It's been done that way in the past. They quit doing it in the 30s, and then we had a prolonged depression. Japan wouldn't allow the debt to be liquidated. The debt should be paid down for moral reasons, but when it gets overwhelming, debt has to be liquidated. But this bad debt and all these derivatives, if the debt wasn't liquidated, what it did, it became part of the Federal Reserve's inventory, and that means the taxpayer owes it. They suffer the consequences of the inflation that bought this. They inflate the money to buy this, but the liquidation didn't occur. And you're absolutely right. You got to liquidate debt. You got to get the government out of the way. You have to deregulate. Everybody screams, oh, there's not enough regulations. If we'd have only had enough regulations on the home builders, told them exactly what to do. Well, we had too much of that. We created a credit and told them they had to make loans.
Right. Well, that's the irony, isn't it, Congressman? We had the mother of all stimulus packages. If stimulus spending could work, it would have worked, because the housing bubble was a direct byproduct of Fannie and Freddie, of a mortgage interest deduction, of direct HUD subsidies. I mean, that was a stimulus package.
It was, and that's what built the bubble. And they think they can solve the problem by more of the same. That's what's totally bewildering. But there are so few. You obviously understand Austrian economics, but in Washington, I don't know if there's that many people in the Congress who would say, oh, yes, I understand the thrust of Austrian economics and the basic theories behind it, and the way prices occur. But they do know Keynesian economics, and they know socialist economics. But where I'm encouraged is when I go outside of Washington and I go to the campuses. For some reason, a lot of young people have been introduced to these ideas, and I think it's groups like the Mises Institute and the Internet.
Well, it's people like you too. It's people like you, too. And the only way we're going to get around this is to cut spending and return to sound money. But that requires that everybody takes a hit, including, and you've been out front on this, and I tend to agree, including the Department of Defense. So we've got to disabuse ourselves of this Wilsonian notion that we can police the world, and yet that seems to be a bipartisan affair. And look what happened when Michael Steele, I thought he was right when he said, why would you put ground troops in Afghanistan? This is Obama's war, a great opportunity for a partisan Republican, by the way, and yet the Republicans savaged the guy.
And that gave me a chance to defend Steele.
Yeah, right.
I went to his defense, and then by the time I got my message out that I was defending him, he apologized.
Right, exactly.
He backtracked. And I said, "No, I'm trying to help the guy out," and he backtracks. But he probably said what he really believed, and I thought it was great. The only thing I do in order to sell this idea that you're talking about is I don't call it defense spending. Because when we go over there and get ourselves into trouble, sometimes we make more enemies, and we're making more trouble for ourselves. If we were spending money to defend this country because somebody's about to invade us, that's one thing. But if we go over and we're being offensive and getting involved, and innocent people being killed, and our troops being unnecessarily killed, I don't call that a defense. It's part of what Eisenhower warned us about. It's the control of this military-industrial complex that wants to make the war profits and make money off of.
Well, Eisenhower had a great tactic. Well, when he was in the White House, you may know of this, but he refused to allow any of his advisors call anything a crisis. Because once you call something a crisis, look out. We got to do something. And no matter how grave things got, he would say, don't call it a crisis, because I don't want these people jumping the gun. So that means we got to deploy this and we've got to do this. And really, everything's a crisis now. The war on education, the war on poverty, the war on the environment, the war on terror. Everything's a crisis. And, of course, with a crisis, you get much bigger government.
And people are more willing to give up their liberties. Oh, this is very bad, and you only give up your liberties under a crisis condition. So if there's a war going on, I mean, there's a drug war going on because it's a crisis, and if not, all the children are going to be taking heroin, so therefore we have to...
I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been waging a lonely libertarian battle on this, Representative Paul. I mean, naturally, talk radio skews right, and we have a lot of traditional conservatives, but when I get on my rant about the failure of prohibition in general, boy, you ought to see some of the nasty mail I get. And a politician won't touch this with a 10-foot pole. But I don't know anyone who thinks that the single motivating factor of the crisis in Mexico is due to anything but illicit drugs and a black market that every economist under the sun would warn us about.
That's why they're killing each other. There's big money into it. You legalize the drugs. There's a coalition, but I don't think it's a deliberate coalition. I think some of the fundamentalist Christians and the drug dealers take the same position. The drug dealers don't want to make it legal. They'd be out of business.
Yeah, they've got a monopoly right now.
Currently, very sincere people who want to take care of their children, or want the government to take care of their children and make sure they don't have any bad habits. They work hard to make these laws of prohibition, but they need only to study alcohol prohibition. There's no idea that alcohol, everybody accepts that now, and still people die from alcohol and cigarettes more than any of the hard drugs. I mean, hard drugs are dangerous, but so are prescription drugs dangerous. We have more people dying from addiction and overdoses of prescription drugs than we do the illegal drugs.
And by the way, everybody, if you don't know, folks, Representative Ron Paul is actually Dr. Ron Paul. So I think that adds a little more credibility. I know you're short for time, but two final questions. In 1932, there was an attempt via the 20th Amendment to ban these sorts of lame duck sessions, that if you can't get the appropriations bills done by October 1st, or at the very least the election, you're not going to be able to come back after you've been voted out of office and bind future generations with some of this nonsense. So I don't even know if a lame duck session is constitutional.
Well, I'm not sure myself on that. I've not heard the argument that it makes it unconstitutional.
It doesn't specifically. It doesn't.
I would say that it's certainly immoral, and it's the intent. Yeah. And what they do is unconstitutional. When you think of all this spending, this $1 billion omnibus bill, I bet you there's not 10% of that is actually authorized under the Constitution.
Is Ron Paul going to run for president in 2012?
Maybe. Pretty soon I'm going to ask him and pin him down and make him commit one way or the other.
No, I'm asking you.
I will be talking to him frequently.
Who is this guy? You talking about your son? All right, that's not a no. Representative Ron Paul, good to have you on the program. Come back again.
Thanks a lot.
You bet. That's the representative, and I'll be back right after this.